Across multiple frontline sectors, Russian infantry is steadily losing the ability to move in ways that never show up clearly on operational maps. Ukrainian FPV UAVs are staying on top of small groups traveling by motorcycle, ATV, and on foot, even through villages, forest edges, and terrain once considered hard to control. When an overhead view is maintained without breaks, familiar survival habits like speeding up, changing direction, or taking quick cover start to lose their power. In snow and harsh weather, the gap keeps widening between what UAVs can see and how fast a human body can react. So who is holding continuous low-altitude observation in this fight? Who can track the smallest movement without ever showing their face? And what happens when being seen becomes the factor that decides every next step? Stay with military force and let's break it down. Low-altitude drone surveillance is turning simple movement into a target, because the side that controls the near sky can see patterns that ground troops cannot hide with speed or routine caution. Recent footage shows Ukrainian FPV teams keeping close watch on small Russian groups moving by motorcycle, ATV, and on foot. And the decisive feature is not the final blast but the steady tracking that comes first. This creates a new combat layer below traditional air power, since a cheap drone can loiter near roads, tree lines, and damaged buildings and keep a target in frame long enough for a clean decision. That persistence matters most in villages and cluttered terrain, because cover that blocks a rifle sight often fails against a top-down camera that can shift angle by a few meters instead of moving through streets. A rider on a village road can feel protected for a moment when walls and corners break ground-level sight lines, yet a drone above rooftops can hold the same route as a continuous picture. Once that picture is established, pressure builds without a firefight, because observation alone forces hesitation, spacing, and detours that slow the mission and weaken coordination. When tracking becomes stable at low altitude, the next problem is not whether movement will be seen, but how quickly that observation can be turned into a committed engagement. The detect-track-commit cycle compresses battlefield decisions, because a unit can shift from moving to being engaged in a window that feels closer to seconds than minutes. A sudden turn or short burst of speed does not reliably break contact, since the drone's advantage is not only pace but also geometry, and it can cut straight across blocks or fields while the target must follow paths and gaps. Roads then stop behaving like routes and start behaving like exposure corridors, because they concentrate movement into predictable lines that simplify reacquisition after even a brief loss of view. Even when a strike does not land cleanly, surveillance still imposes costs, because a group that is forced to pause, scatter, or hug cover loses tempo and becomes easier to manage as separate pieces. This is why reconnaissance and attack fusing into one platform changes the meaning of control, since control is no longer measured only by trenches and map lines, but by who can watch movement and convert it into timing. Small teams are pushed into contact behavior before any shots are fired, because every step must be treated as if it is already recorded and ready to be acted on. With the sky holding continuous attention, the next question is no longer whether a unit will be spotted, but how it can break tracking after it has already been spotted. Speed often fails against FPV drones because the chase is not decided by road pace, but by whether the target can break the camera's stable lock. A motorcycle or ATV can surge forward and still remain centered in the drone's view, since the aircraft can take straighter lines across yards, gaps, and open patches while the rider stays constrained by corners and narrow routes. A sharp turn may look like a clean escape on the ground, yet it often becomes only a change of background, because the drone needs only a few seconds of steady angle to set up the final approach. This is why going faster can become a trap, because higher speed reduces the time available to choose exits, and it pushes the target deeper into a corridor where the next cover point may already be watched. When speed cannot open real separation, the next instinct is to hide. But short-term cover brings a different set of limits. Temporary hiding loses value once tracking is established, because most quick shelters block one direction while the drone can adjust altitude and look down into the same space. A tree, a bush line, or a broken wall can interrupt a ground-level view, yet an overhead camera can shift a few meters and wait. And the moment a shoulder moves or a foot steps out, the hiding place is mapped. In damaged villages, tight spaces can feel protective, but they can also restrict exits, so a target that dives into a pocket may gain seconds while also narrowing choices to one or two predictable paths. That is how a safe spot turns into a holding pen, because the drone does not need to rush, and it can hover until the target either runs or freezes. Once cover becomes a delay rather than a solution, last-second reactions start appearing, and they rarely change the outcome when commitment has already begun. Improvised defense tends to arrive too late, because firing upward or throwing objects usually happens after the drone has already committed to its flight path and selected the entry line. At that stage, the target is reacting inside a shrinking window, and even a brave response can become ineffective if it does not force a loss of control, a hard angle change, or a broken visual lock. Some targets do survive, and those cases matter because they show the boundaries of FPV power. Since buildings, hills, and signal disruption can break the line between the drone and its operator. These limits do not remove the threat, because the bigger damage is often tempo, as repeated interruptions push movement into stop and start bursts that weaken coordination and make the next sprint less organized. When neither speed nor quick shelter reliably ends tracking, pressure shifts towards sustained drone presence, and scale becomes part of the battlefield logic. Drone pressure becomes harder to escape when it is repeated at scale, because one successful dodge matters less if new aircraft can reappear over the same routes and force the same decisions again. Ukraine's procurement goals underline that intent, since its defense officials have described plans to acquire around 4.5 million FPV drones in 2025, with a budget measured in billions of dollars and a heavy share sourced from domestic producers. That volume helps explain why low-cost drones can be spent on single riders, small groups, and short chases, because the system is designed for constant pressure rather than rare precision strikes. On the other side, improvised counters such as netting over roads show how forces try to interrupt the final run. Yet even those measures signal that basic movement has become a technical problem, not only a tactical one. This pressure also forces units to slow resupply, move at odd hours, and accept longer detours, which quietly reshapes the front's daily rhythm. And when people cannot run faster or hide deeper, terrain and weather begin to decide the rest of the pursuit. Winter conditions shift the balance toward drones because snow slows the target while the aircraft keeps its tempo, so the time between detection and engagement can shrink instead of growing. In snow-covered sectors, infantry movement becomes heavier and more deliberate, and that slower pace gives an FPV operator more time to confirm direction, distance, and likely exits. Snow does not need to be deep to matter, because even a thin layer changes contrast from above and turns ordinary routes into visible lines across open ground. This is why winter can make the first sighting more decisive, since the drone can hold a target in frame longer while the target is still trying to pick the next piece of cover. Once detection lasts longer, the next problem is that harsh conditions also reduce the options needed to evade at the last moment. Harsh weather reduces evasive choices because acceleration and sudden turns depend on traction, stamina, and clean footing, and all three degrade when snow, ice, and wind push the body toward caution. A soldier can try to sprint, yet boots slide and breathing spikes, so the run becomes uneven and easier to predict than it would be on dry soil. Cold raises the penalty for hesitation because a short pause in the open is not only a tactical risk, but also a physical burden, and that burden narrows the willingness to keep moving under pressure. This turns escape into a timing problem, because the drone's approach stays smooth, while human movement becomes slower and less able to change direction sharply. When a target finally notices the drone overhead, awareness arrives first, but the ability to act on that awareness often arrives too late. Once a target realizes a drone is overhead, slow movement makes the response feel behind the beat, because decisions must be made faster than the body can execute them in winter conditions. A group may attempt to change direction, yet the shift is often gradual rather than sharp, since the ground punishes sudden moves and forces a careful pace that the drone can match. Bad weather does not reliably blind the drone, because many flights happen at low altitude where the operator can still hold visual contact, and short-range guidance needs only a brief clear view to commit. Wind and snowfall can reduce stability, yet those effects are uneven, so an operator can wait for a calmer second and then push in when the target is mid-step and unable to reset. In these moments, even a minor slip can hold the body long enough for the drone to close the last meters. Beyond the moment of contact, winter also reshapes the background conditions that make tracking easier over time. The environment becomes an ally of UAV tracking because winter strips away foliage and soft cover, and that loss of concealment exposes shapes and movement that might blend in during warmer months. At village edges and tree lines, bare branches and flattened grass leave fewer visual breaks, so a person crossing between objects can be held in frame with less effort than in a green season. Cold limits comfort and recovery, so units drift toward predictable habits such as using the same tracks, the same doorways, or the same sheltered corners, and predictability is dangerous under constant observation. A repeated route becomes a known lane, and a known lane can be watched until a drone arrives at the right moment, which quietly increases control without any dramatic breakthrough. This effect also drains morale, because winter already wears soldiers down, and constant overhead pressure removes the few moments that feel safe. However, UAVs are not winning only because winter helps them, because the next shift is how drones are being used as deliberate traps that pull soldiers into the blast zone. A dead drone on the ground can be more dangerous than a flying one, because it turns curiosity and routine battlefield checks into a trigger that the attacker controls. Footage that shows a drone appearing inactive and then detonating as a soldier approaches signals a shift in how unmanned systems are being used, since the drone is no longer only a fast strike platform, but also a planted trap that waits for human behavior. This matters because troops are trained to confirm what they see, recover useful equipment, and clear hazards from routes, and those habits keep units alive during normal operations. A baited drone attacks that training directly because it creates a false sense of safety and then punishes the exact moment a soldier tries to make the area safer for others. The mechanism does not need to be technically complex to be effective, because the real advantage is psychological timing, and one sudden blast can reshape how a whole small unit treats objects on the ground. Once a single trap proves real, the battlefield changes even when no drone is visible, because doubt begins to guide movement. After one such event, any object that looks harmless can feel suspicious, and that suspicion slows movement even without a confirmed threat. Soldiers begin to detour around items they would normally inspect, and they hesitate at road edges, doorway thresholds, and tree lines, because the cost of one wrong step now feels immediate and personal. That hesitation has tactical value for the side-laying traps, because it breaks rhythm and makes a unit late, and being late on a drone-saturated front can be as costly as taking fire. The danger zone also expands backward from the point of contact, because a drone trap can remain behind after an engagement and still claim victims during resupply, casualty evacuation, or route clearance. This pushes risk into spaces that are supposed to be rear, and it forces commanders to treat even short stretches of road as contested, since the threat is not only overhead but also underfoot. When rear areas start behaving like contact zones, simple recovery and coordination tasks become slower, and that slowdown creates new vulnerabilities. Once recovery becomes risky, units also lose chances to capture enemy gear, study components, or remove hazards, and that reduces learning and adaptation over time. A battlefield littered with potential traps becomes harder to manage, because teams must add steps such as marking suspected devices, calling for remote destruction, or waiting for specialists. Each extra step costs time and manpower, and it can force more people to cluster at one point, which creates a second vulnerability if another drone arrives overhead. This is why drone traps can disrupt coordination even without frequent use, because the possibility alone changes the pace of movement and the way teams communicate in the open. Leaders are then pushed into harder trade-offs because they must balance speed against safety, and that decision becomes sharper when darkness, fatigue, or bad weather reduces attention. In practice, what looks like a single explosion becomes a change in workflow because units shift from check and clear to avoid and bypass. And bypass often means longer routes and more exposure. And when risk spreads into routine tasks, both sides are pushed toward a dual mission, hunting ground targets while also hunting the drones that enable these traps. Counter UAV work is now a frontline requirement because a supply route only stays usable if drones on both sides are found and neutralized before they can shape the next move. In the footage, the key detail is not a dogfight, but a moment where Ukrainian infantry identifies a Russian drone threat on a road and acts fast enough to remove it, showing anti-drone action has moved down to the small unit level. A road is not just pavement in this environment, because one drone can force reroutes into worse terrain. That reality reframes the contest, because it is no longer only about who owns more drones, and it is about who can hold low-altitude awareness longer while denying the other side stable observation. Once both sides treat roads like contested airspace, Russia's movement choices begin to look less like preference and more like necessity. Russia's response shows the same pressure, because motorcycles and ATVs appear as answers to a watched battlefield where larger vehicles are easier to detect and easier to hit. These small platforms can reduce the time a rider spends exposed and can slip through tight lanes faster, yet they also strip away protection, since there is little armor, limited ability to carry heavy gear, and fewer options to fight back if contact happens. A motorcycle can reach a point quickly, but it cannot absorb fragments or sustain a prolonged exchange, so the choice trades survivability for speed and accepts higher risk if tracking is maintained. ATVs offer more load capacity, yet they still leave passengers open, and they tend to follow predictable tracks, which makes them vulnerable when a drone holds the corridor rather than chasing a single vehicle. When even small engines feel too visible, the next step is to reach for methods that look older than the war, but they face the same sky. The appearance of horses pushes adaptation further, because it suggests an attempt to lower mechanical signatures, reduce fuel dependence, and move in places where engines and heat would be noticed sooner. However, a horse is not invisible from above, and a group on a dirt road can still be tracked by shape, spacing, and direction. So dispersion alone does not guarantee safety when low-altitude observation remains steady. This is why low-tech movement can help with logistics under pressure, yet it cannot solve the core problem, since the problem is not the engine, and it is the enemy's ability to keep the route in view. Taken together, these choices send two signals at once, because they show tactical learning on the ground while also hinting at limits in protection and escort firepower. When a force must rely on speed, light vehicles, and even animals to cross short distances, the battlefield becomes less forgiving for standard convoys, and commanders accept slower schedules, higher risk, or both. All of these pieces point to a larger conclusion, because once UAVs control the low sky, the entire mechanism of approaching the front starts to lock up as a system rather than as isolated incidents. FPV drones are locking movement into a monitored process because safety is no longer based on distance from the enemy, and it is based on whether observation can be broken long enough to move and reset. This changes the meaning of mobility, since a unit can be far from the trench line and still be exposed if it is moving through a watched corridor that drones regularly scan. When short-term hiding no longer works, formations are pushed to move only in rare windows, and those windows depend on terrain, smoke, jamming, darkness, or simple luck with drone coverage. The cost of that system is coordination, because units that cannot assemble freely start arriving in pieces, and a force that arrives in pieces loses the ability to surge, reinforce, or exploit a brief opening. Harsh weather and difficult ground tighten the trap, because they cut down the number of usable routes and reduce how fast people can switch direction once they realize they have been spotted. In winter conditions, the drone keeps its pace while the target slows, and that mismatch turns small hesitations into permanent exposure. Once movement becomes a series of narrow windows, the next pressure point is the network behind the fight, because roads and resupply start behaving like frontline tasks. Drone traps and counter UAV pressure add risk on both sides of the contact line because danger remains after the first strike and because roads must be treated as contested even when the front is quiet. This forces slower resupply, longer detours, and more time spent on route checks, and those frictions drain combat power without a single dramatic battle. Over time, the effect becomes systemic because reconnaissance, movement, and attack tempo are linked, and a disruption in one link cascades into the next. A unit that cannot move predictably cannot supply predictably, and a unit that cannot supply predictably cannot keep pressure on the enemy for long. This is why Russia's approaches to the front line can be interrupted in sequence, from the first attempt to scout a lane, to the next attempt to move men and gear, to the final attempt to maintain a push under constant observation. The wider takeaway is that FPV dominance is not just tactical, because it reshapes daily logistics, morale, and command decisions, and it turns routine tasks into high-stress events. And when mobility is locked link by link, the rest of the picture depends on measurable signs, and on political military scenarios that can plausibly follow from those signs. Russia will face a hard trade because it can invest in smoke, decoys, jamming, and route discipline to protect movement, or it can accept higher losses each time forces push toward the line. Ukraine will have strong incentives to expand multi-role UAV units, since the same teams that hunt ground targets also need to clear enemy drones and keep narrow movement corridors open. The most useful signs to watch are measurable, because FPV density in key sectors, the success rate of counter UAV actions, and the length of safe mobility windows will show whether pressure is easing or tightening. If those windows grow longer, attacks can regain tempo and units can assemble with less risk. If they stay short, the front line will be shaped less by big breakthroughs and more by daily attrition, delays, and the steady loss of freedom to move. Subscribe to Military Force for clear, grounded battlefield analysis that stays focused on facts, not hype. Learn how modern weapons and tactics really work, and why understanding them matters for protecting lives and preventing wider conflict. Because informed citizens are one of the few tools that can push leaders toward restraint, accountability, and peace.